Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware stands for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, May 9th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging throughout the world. In the 1930s and 40s, the countries most responsible for war in the world were Germany and Japan. Today, the one country most responsible for war in the world is the one for which we're responsible, the United States of America. In the years since World War II ended in 1945, U.S. presidents have killed more than 20 million people in 37 nations. It continues to be true, as Martin Luther King said long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own government. At this moment, the U.S. government is making war and killing people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Thousands of U.S. troops are fighting in these wars, although most Americans are not aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less but than American death squads, out to get bad guys, as they say, who might be thought of as affecting American interests, usually financial. Furthermore, our government is provoking new wars against countries with nuclear weapons in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, the Middle East, Korea, and the South China Sea. We rightly deplore radical Islamic terrorism, in spite of the fact that the U.S. government set it up 40 years ago to use against Russia and cooperates with it in various places today. But we are by far the greatest terrorist regime in the world. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world, not Russia or China or North Korea or Iran? The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. When World War II ended, the U.S. was the only undamaged major country and controlled the world economy for the benefit of that 1%. In all the years since, U.S. administrations have been willing to kill people and make war to maintain the disparity, as American planner George Kennan put it. The result was nothing less than 3 generations of American war up to today against people struggling to control their own countries. Since the Second World War, the U.S. has attempted to overthrow more than 50 governments, most of them democratically elected, attempted to suppress a populist or nationalist movement in 20 countries, grossly interfered in democratic elections in at least 30 countries, dropped bombs on the people of more than 30 countries, and attempted to assassinate more than 50 foreign leaders. In total, the United States has carried out one or more of these actions in 69 countries. The enemy changes its name from communism to Islamism, but the U.S. makes war against governments not under U.S. control or influence, or that prevent the U.S. from occupying a strategic position in our campaign to control the world economy. The sheer scale of suffering we cause, let alone the criminality, is little known in our country. The most numerous victims of our terrorism are Muslims. 500,000 Iraqi infants died in the 1990s as a result of the embargo imposed by the Clinton administration. And extreme jihadism, radical Islamic terrorism, which led to 9/11, was invented by the Carter administration 40 years ago, when the CIA rounded up some Muslim fanatics, armed them, and sent them into Afghanistan, quote, to give the Russians a Vietnam of their own, close quote, as President Carter's national security advisor said. Our anti-war group, AWARE, was established 15 years ago, after the attacks of 9/11-2001, by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East and its energy resources. In those years, the U.S. has attempted in particular to the U.S. doesn't need oil from the Mideast, but Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia. And so control over them gives the U.S. a major advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. A chokehold which benefits only the American economic elite, the 1%. In 2003, the U.S. illegally invaded Iraq and killed perhaps 1 million people for that purpose, and now has thousands of troops and mercenaries throughout the Middle East. The U.S. government says we're fighting terrorism, but we are in fact creating terrorists in response particularly to our drone assassinations, the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, which have killed more than 5,000 people, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children. Those of us in Aware, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, call upon President Trump to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, and stop the drone attacks. 3, cut military spending by at least 50%, and close the more than 700 foreign military bases the U.S. has around the world. Neither Russia nor China has more than 12. Bring U.S. troops and weapons home, and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the countries of the world. 4, stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account in the American media, which are dominated by pro-war people and the political establishment, both Republican and Democrat. I want to mention, first of all, the showing of a film at the Art Theater in Champaign tonight. Aware will distribute a flyer making the points that I've just made at that showing. This is part of a series the Art Theater is doing about the Mideast. The film is called The Seventh Art Stand, and at 7 o'clock tonight, the Art Theater is showing the film Sunita, a film that won prizes at the Sundance Film Festival. It is, I'm quoting here, tells the inspiring story of Sunita Alizadeh, an 18-year-old Afghan refugee in Iran who thinks of Michael Jackson and Rihanna as her spiritual parents and dreams of becoming a big-time rapper. For the time being, her only fans are the other teenage girls in a Tehran shelter, and her family has a very different future planned for her. As a bride, she's worth $9,000. Iranian director Roxera Ghaem-Maghami, whose earlier film was called Going Up the Stairs, poignantly shifts from observer to participant, altering expectations as Sunita's stories unfolds in this personal and joyful portrait. An intimate portrait of creativity and womanhood, Sunita highlights the rarely seen intricacies and shifting contrasts of Iranian society through the lens of an artist who is defining the next generation. Close quote. That's the description the Art Theater distributed of the film Sunita, shown tonight at 7 p.m. From 6 to 7 p.m. at the Art Theater, members of Aware will be distributing a flyer about the U.S. Illegally making war in the Middle East and targeting particularly Iran. The crucial fact about Iran, which we should begin with, is that for the past 60 years, not a day has passed in which the U.S. has not been torturing Iranians. That's 60 years right now. It began with a military coup, which overthrew the parliamentary regime in 1953, installed the Shah, the word means king, a brutal dictator. Amnesty International described him as one of the worst, most extreme torturers in the world, year after year. When he was overthrown by a popular revolution in 1979, the U.S. almost immediately turned to supporting Saddam Hussein in Iraq in an assault against Iran, which killed hundreds of thousands of Iranians, used extensively chemical weapons. Think of that when you hear about the talk about chemical weapons supposedly being used in Syria. The U.S. encouraged it and supported and indeed provided the weapons for Iraq to attack Iran because the Iranians had the temerity of throwing out the dictator that the U.S. had established in Iran. At the same time, Saddam Hussein in Iraq attacked his own Kurdish population with those chemical weapons as well. And the U.S. supported all of this. The Reagan administration even tried to, actually it succeeded in preventing a censure of Iraq for attacking Iran in the United Nations. The United States essentially won the war against Iran by its support for Iraq. Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, was a favorite of the Reagan and first Bush administration to such an extent that George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, right after the war in 1989, invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for advanced training in nuclear weapons production. That's the country that had devastated Iran, horrifying attack after horrifying attack and war. Right after that, Iran was subjected to harsh sanctions, and it continues right until the moment. So we have a 60-year record of torturing Iranians. Americans don't pay attention to it, even when the Obama administration discussed a pact with Iran that would call upon them to eliminate their non-existent nuclear weapons. But there's a continuity in American policy that has involved murder and mayhem on the people of Iranians, and they are aware of it. Why the assault against Iran? We're back to a mafia principle. In 1979, the Iranians carried out an illegitimate act. They overthrew a tyrant that the United States had imposed and supported and moved on an independent path, not following U.S. orders. That was the Iranian Revolution of '79. That conflicts with the mafia doctrine by which the world is pretty much ruled. Credibility must be maintained by the world ruler, the United States. The Godfather cannot permit independence and successful defiances, as in the case of Cuba. So Iran has to be punished for the same thing. The pretext in recent years was that Iran had a nuclear weapons program. Well, the New York Times finally admitted that if Iran was developing nuclear weapons, U.S. intelligence didn't know about it. According to U.S. intelligence, in regular reports to Congress, if Iran were developing nuclear weapons, it would be part of their deterrence strategy. That is part of their strategy to defend themselves from external attack. As U.S. intelligence pointed out, Iran has very little ability to deploy force. It's low military expenditures, even by regional standards, but it does have a deterrence strategy, and with good reasons. It's surrounded by nuclear powers, which are backed by the United States, and have refused to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The three of them, Israel, India, and Pakistan, all developed nuclear weapons with U.S. assistance. India and Israel continue to maintain U.S. support for their nuclear weapons programs and other programs, such as the occupation of part of Syria in violation of Security Council orders. Iran is constantly threatened not just by the United States, but by the U.S. domestic partners. The United States and Israel, two major nuclear powers, one a superpower, the other a regional superpower, are constantly threatening Iran with attack, and that's a violation, of course, of the U.S. Charter, even the threat, which bans the threat or use of force. But the U.S. is self-immunized from international law, and its clients inherit that right. So Iran is under constant threat. It's surrounded by hostile nuclear states. It would be perfectly understandable were it to develop a nuclear strategy, but it has in fact agreed not to, and American intelligence has grudgingly admitted that it seems not to be doing so. We might ask ourselves why, in these circumstances, the United States regards Iran as what's called the gravest threat to world peace. That's a media report repeated once again this week. Iran is the greatest threat to world peace, greatest threat in the region, because of its non-existent nuclear programs. That's the U.S. position. Well, most of the country of the world belong to the non-aligned movement, which had in fact just had its regular meeting in Tehran in Iran at the time the U.S. began the discussions of the nuclear pact, the nuclear deal. It vigorously supported Iran's right to enrich uranium as a signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, unlike Israel and India. That is, Iran signed the treaty, Israel and India had not. In the Arab world, Iran is disliked, very seriously disliked. Tensions go back many centuries, but it's not regarded as a threat. They don't like it, but they don't regard it as a threat. A very small percentage in the Arab world regard Iran as a threat, let alone the gravest, but the majority, and certainly the population of the Arab world, do not. That's shown by poll after poll, polls taken by leading Western polling agencies. The reference is in the accounts of Iranian opposition to the U.S. is Iranian hostility to the U.S. Sorry, let me try that again. The references in Arab hostility to Iran in the Middle East has been encouraged by the United States, but it's not a popular hostility at all. It's a hostility of several governments. Saudi Arabia is the most extreme fundamentalist state in the world. That's radical Islamic terrorism, and it is also Iran's principal enemy. Saudi Arabia is expending huge efforts for many years to disseminate its extremist Wahhabi Salafi version of Islam, radical Islamic terrorism, all with U.S. backing. It's a dictatorship. There was no Arab Spring in Saudi Arabia. And the dictators there and other Arab emirates probably do support U.S. policy against Iran. And as for the U.S. and the U.S. media and commentary, it's enough for the dictators to support us. It doesn't matter what the population of these countries thinks. Well, that's the Arab world, and the same is true in the rest of the world. The obsession with Iran is a U.S. obsession and draws in some of its allies. We'll mention also that the hostility to Iran is encouraged by the new national security advisor for the Trump administration, H.R. McMaster. Now, McMaster, who has been cried up as a scholar general and a defender of U.S. interests in the Middle East, does seem, in fact, to be not only extremely hostile to Iran, but now finally, interestingly enough, on the outs with the president himself. This is an article from a right-wing commentator, Eli Lake, on the Bloomberg site. For the Washington establishment, President Donald Trump's decision to make General H.R. McMaster his national security advisor in February was a masterstroke. Here is a well-respected defense intellectual, praised by both parties, lending a steady hand to the chaotic White House. The grown-ups are back. Now, that's what a hawkish neocon commentator says in the Washington Press about this new national security advisor, H.R. McMaster. But inside the White House, the McMaster pick has not gone over well with the one man who matters most. White House officials tell me, writes Eli Lake, that Trump himself has clashed with McMaster in front of his staff. On policy, the faction of the White House loyal to senior strategist Steve Bannon is convinced McMaster is trying to trick the president into the kind of nation building that Trump campaigned against. By nation building here he means the aggressive Middle Eastern policy carried out by the Bush and Obama administrations, the policies that Trump criticized in the campaign, and indeed one of the reasons Trump was elected president is that he criticized the war-making policies of the Obama administration in the Middle East. Now it's being said that McMaster represents those policies, the continuation of those policies from the Bush and Obama administration, and encourages war-making in the Middle East, particularly in terms of hostility to Iran. McMaster's allies and adversaries inside the White House tell me, writes Eli Lake, that Trump is disillusioned with him. This professional military officer has failed to read the president by not giving him a chance to ask questions during briefings, at times even lecturing Trump. The attempt by the military establishment, so to speak, to overcome Trump's anti-interventionist asseverations from the campaign seems to have found a point man in the National Security Advisor. Trump himself has clashed with McMaster in front of his staff. On policy, the faction of the White House, loyal to senior strategist Steve Bannon, is convinced McMaster is trying to trick the president into resuming the policies of the previous administration. Trump was livid, according to 3 White House officials, after reading in the Wall Street Journal that McMaster had called his South Korean counterpart. South Korea has just elected a dovish president who wants to do a deal with North Korea rather than to crank up the belligerent talk that we've been hearing from Washington about North Korea. Trump was livid, according to 3 White House officials, after reading in the Wall Street Journal that McMaster had called his South Korean counterpart, that is to say the National Security Advisor to the South Korean government, to assure him that the president's threat, Trump's threat, to make that country, South Korea, pay for a new missile defense system was not official policy. Here's the American National Security Advisor contradicting the president. These officials say Trump screamed at McMaster on a phone call, accusing him of undercutting efforts to get South Korea to pay its fair share. This was not an isolated incident. Trump has complained in front of McMaster and intelligence briefings about the, quote, the general undermining of my policy, close quote, of Trump. According to 2 White House officials, the president has given McMaster less face time, i.e., doesn't talk to him. McMaster's requests to brief the president before some press interviews have been declined. Over last weekend, McMaster did not accompany Trump to meet Australia's Prime Minister. The outgoing Deputy National Security Advisor, K.T. McFarlane, went instead. Trump credits McMaster with coming up with the plan to strike a Syrian air base last month. Much talk about the fact that Tomahawk missiles were sent into a Syrian air base, ostensibly in response to a sarin gas attack by the Damascus government, an attack that many people think never occurred. But in any case, the United States did indeed attack an air base in Syria, and everyone said, well, you see, Trump is simply falling in with the policies of the previous administration. Now it seems that that decision, according to Trump, was made by McMaster, the National Security Advisor. Trump has privately expressed regret for choosing McMaster. The first conflict between McMaster and Trump was about the major speech the president delivered at the end of February to a joint session of Congress. McMaster pleaded with the president not to use the phrase radical Islamic terrorism. Now, why would the National Security Advisor ask Trump not to use that phrase? The answer is that the primary allies and clients for American war-making in the Mideast are, of course, radical Islamic terrorists, Saudi Arabia most notably. And therefore, the attack on radical Islamic terrorism reads very badly when the U.S. is trying to convince the Sunni alliance in the Middle East, that is primarily Saudi Arabia and Israel, to carry out the military actions that the U.S. has in mind, notably against ISIS. McMaster wanted Trump to avoid the phrase radical Islamic terrorism because it offended our Saudi allies. He sent memos throughout the government complaining about a draft of the speech, Trump's speech, that included the phrase, but the phrase remained in the speech. When Trump delivered the speech, he echoed his campaign rhetoric by emphasizing each word, radical Islamic terrorism. McMaster had asked his inherited deputy, by the way, McFarland, to leave by May 10th. She is now expected to stay on for the time being. Now, these fights within the administration have a great deal to do with who lives and dies in the Middle East. Whether the criticism of American Middle East war-making that Trump enunciated during the campaign will in fact be put into practice, or whether the war-making that has been inherited from the last administration, Obama was the first American president ever to be at war throughout 2 presidential terms, whether that will continue. That fight's going on in Washington right now, and Iran seems in many ways to be the focus of it. The Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, is coming to Washington next week to negotiate with the American Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. Syria, Iran, and even Ukraine are very much on the agenda. This is very important because it's not at all clear which faction in the Trump White House will in fact be carrying on the discussion with the Russians, who have done a quite remarkable job recently of arranging pacified zones within Syria. So the question of American Middle Eastern war-making is very much on the agenda, and most of the moves are being made behind the scenes in the Trump administration and in the negotiations between America and Russia. It's worthwhile keeping an eye on this, and it's difficult to do so because American media does a very bad job of telling you what the various positions are and who the players are. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group in the 19th week of 2017. Another week in which the world concedes the most extreme global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. The second half of today's show is a discussion of Iran from the Ron Paul Institute, which takes up some of the themes we've been talking about today. My thanks to J.B. Nicholson for research. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Joseph Cash, Andrew Scholarly, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see the Facebook page for Aware for articles referred to tonight. Remember, too, tonight at from 6 to 7 p.m. in front of the Art Theater in downtown Champaign, where we'll be distributing leaflets on war in the Middle East, flyers on war in the Middle East, before the showing of a film about Iran and a discussion, apparently, afterwards. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't: Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, David Johnson, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.